The safe. That's what the Israelis call the maximum security prison in Gilboa. Well, it doesn't seem like much of a safe anymore. 6 Palestinian men have escaped from there in what is effectively the most notorious jailbreak of the last 20 years. And while Israelis have launched a giant manhunt trying to clear up the embarrassment, Palestinians have been celebrating the escape as an act of defiance against the occupation and a much-needed boost of morale. So how did they do it, you ask? How did 6 men tunnel out of an Israeli maximum security prison? Well, they did it using a spoon, of course. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. In the early hours of Monday morning on September 6th, a daring prison escape took place in cell number 5, Wing 2 of the Israeli maximum security prison in Gilboa. Nicknamed the Safe, 6 Palestinian men broke out of their prison cell through a hole under the shower using a tunnel that they had dug with a rusty spoon. Gilboa prison was built back in 2004 and sits 6 kilometers away from the West Bank and just 16 kilometers from the Jordanian border. This is where Palestinians are sent to serve long and even life sentences. Considered one of the occupation's toughest prisons, the cells do not even have windows. The escapees dug a tunnel around 22 meters long for several months before finally escaping on September 6th at around 1 a.m. The prison didn't even know there had been an escape until locals reported seeing something suspicious to the occupation authorities, who then informed the prison. And by the time they did a head count and realized 6 prisoners were missing, 3 hours had already passed. Now, the 6 men who escaped are Mahmoud Arida, incarcerated since 1996, life in prison. Muhammad Arida, incarcerated since 2002, life in prison. Ayham Kamanji, incarcerated since 2006, life in prison. Yaqub Qadri, incarcerated since 2003, life in prison. Zakaria Zubaydi, in prison since 2019, awaiting trial. Munad al-Nufayat, incarcerated since 2019, without charge. Now, 5 of the men are members of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Meanwhile, Zakaria Zubaydi, perhaps the most famous of the 6, was a former commander of the Al-Aqsa Marches Brigade and a very prominent figure in the Palestinian resistance. His mother was killed by an Israeli sniper, as was his brother, and their home demolished 3 times by the Israelis. On the morning of the escape, videos emerged showing the Israeli prison guards examining the tunnel which the prisoners had dug. And the fact that 6 Palestinian resistance fighters had outsmarted one of the Israelis' most highly secured prisons with literally a spoon drew laughter and mockery online as people compared the prison break to movies like Shawshank Redemption and flooded the internet with memes. Now, in Western movies and media, the Israelis always love to portray themselves as extremely intelligent and competent, perpetuating this myth that they are smarter than everyone else and they are the best in technology and security. Well, it turns out all that was needed to defeat one of their maximum security prisons were 6 determined Palestinians and 1 spoon, a rusty spoon, which they hid behind a poster, hence the comparisons to Shawshank. Not only that, but the men also managed to evade 40 guards, 3 watchtowers, 2 walls, barbed wires, security cameras, and a pack of sniffer dogs. The Israelis, of course, didn't find the jokes very funny and launched a manhunt instead in an attempt to capture the men. And when news of the escape broke, many towns and cities in Palestine erupted in celebration, with people handing out sweets in the street. Both Hamas and Fatah celebrated the escape, calling on Palestinians to protect and aid the escapees. Most of the men actually come from Jenin, which is located not too far from the prison. And residents of their hometown erupted in celebration, as did Palestinians in Gaza, Jerusalem, the West Bank, and all over, heralding the 6 as heroes. Protests were also held in solidarity with those who are still incarcerated, after Israel, in response, imposed punitive measures, such as moving prisoners of Islamic Jihad into different prisons, closing the prisoner shop which sells basic necessities. The Israelis also limited the number of prisoners allowed in the yard at any given time, and reduced the time they're allowed to spend outside to just 1 hour a day. Now, this whole incident was such an embarrassment for the Israelis, they even began arresting the family members of the escaped men as a form of collective punishment, detaining at least 7 family members. And this reminds us of last year when the Israelis killed Iyad Halla, a 32-year-old Palestinian man. He was autistic, and after the Israeli forces killed him in cold blood, they raided his parents' house in an attempt to find something incriminating and intimidate his family. Meanwhile, the Israeli media has begun offering a myriad of responses as to why this escape happened. First, they said that the blueprints for the prison were posted online by the architecture firm that built the prison. That firm's website is subsequently gone offline. Israeli media also reported that perhaps one of the guards had fallen asleep, or that the prisoners maybe had someone helping them on the inside or the outside. All these wild explanations, except the very obvious one, that they had simply been outsmarted and defeated by the 6 freedom fighters. Now, despite the success of the escape and finally being free and able to breathe in the fresh air of Palestine again, this freedom was to be short-lived, unfortunately. A few days later, on the night of September 10th, 4 of the escaped men were captured by Israeli forces, just a few hours apart. Yaqub Qadri and Mahmoud Arida were detained just a few hours later near the town of Shibli al Ghanam. And in the early morning hours of September 19th, the last 2 men, Kamamji and Nufayat, were detained by Israeli forces near their hometown of Jenin. And of course, one of the first things the occupation does is post photographs of the men in handcuffs on social media in order to show off and posture, and more importantly, before they've been beaten and tortured. For they surely wouldn't post those pictures, would they? And while the Israeli media calls the men terrorists, it's quite ironic, given that Zakaria Zubaydi has been waiting 2 years for a trial, and Munadil Nufayat hasn't even been charged with the crime, let alone convicted. And of course, the other 4 are only terrorists in the eyes of the occupying power because they dared to resist, and they surely didn't receive fair trials. Although there were rumors online and in the Israeli media that the captured men had been turned in to the occupation forces by other Palestinians, this is false. This claim was refuted by one of the escapees, Muhammad al-Arida, who insisted that no one had reported them or turned them in. It was simply bad luck, as they were spotted by an Israeli patrol. The escapees never interacted with anyone, never asked for assistance, precisely to avoid the Israelis exacting revenge on others. Indeed, it was widely feared that were the men to be recaptured, they would face severe punishment at the hands of the Israelis. And this, unfortunately, proved to be true. A photograph of Zakaria Zubaydi shows his face completely swollen from the beatings after being arrested. Zakaria was beaten and tortured so badly that he had to be transferred to a hospital, to the intensive care unit. His brother has told the media that it is very difficult to get any news or updates about his health, as this is being kept secret by the Israelis. Later on, the occupation court decided to extend the detention of the 4 escapees who had been recaptured, and even blocked them from meeting with their lawyers, making it difficult to check on their health and well-being. Zakaria's defense lawyer, Avidor Feldman, told the Associated Press that Zakaria was taken to hospital and given painkillers because of fractures to his jaw and 2 of his ribs after being beaten up during arrest. Muhammad Arida, who was captured alongside Zakaria, was also severely beaten during arrest before being taken to a police station and stripped naked for interrogation. As of now, the 4 escapees are being held by the Shin Bet in another prison and put through excruciating interrogations that last all day. We'll be right back after this short break. Now, joining me on the program from Jerusalem is Palestinian politician, activist, and scholar, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. She served as an official spokesperson of the Palestinian delegation to the Middle East peace process, and until last year, as a senior member of the PLO Executive Committee. She held several posts within the Palestinian Authority, the Arab League, as well as the PLO. As an activist, she founded several bodies and institutions dedicated to Palestinian self-determination, such as the Independent Commission for Human Rights. Dr. Ashrawi, it's an honor to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you, Richard.
Doctor, can I just begin perhaps a bit more broadly with the West now marking the anniversary of the so-called Abraham Accords? What do you make of that? And what are your thoughts on the current state of the resistance? I mean, do you think that in the last month since Al-Aqsa and everything that's happened since, do you believe that the resistance is headed in the right direction?
Yeah, well, the celebration of Abraham Accords is really a very cynical manipulation of a very bad situation in which the conflict is perpetuated with the complicity and collusion of some Arab countries or some Arab regimes that were either blackmailed or bribed into normalizing with Israel, which means normalizing the occupation and injustice and lawlessness and so on. That's another issue we can talk about for a long time. Palestinian resistance is ongoing. It has never stopped. The question is, what shape does it take? What expression does it adopt? It adopts many shapes, many expressions, and basically it is firmly embedded in the Palestinian people's refusal to surrender.
And the recent escape by the 6 men from Gilboa, what does that mean particularly for the resistance? Why is this escape so important in its timing, its scale, and its nature? And how does it play into everything that we just talked about?
The most significant aspect of this latest phase is, of course, the expression of total unity among the younger generation of all Palestinians everywhere. Well, the 6 liberated or self-liberated prisoners have captured the imagination of the Palestinian people, and actually of the world, of people of conscience. These are Palestinians unjustly imprisoned in many cases under unlawfully kept within prisons in Israel and judged by a military court of the occupation. So, and kept in one of the most secure prisons in Israel, Gilboa, and they managed persistently and in an amazing way to dig this tunnel, to be able to find their way to freedom. It gave the Palestinians a sense of hope, a boost of morale, that even Israel's most militarily secured location is not immune to the Palestinian spirit and yearning to be free. This was the most important message. And all the Palestinian people united in defending them, supporting them, and expressing a sense of solidarity and appreciation, while expressing also our yearning to be free. There are different types of captivity, but as you know, all of Palestine is being held captive by Israel.
You know, we saw the Israeli media say that the prison's blueprints were left online by the architecture firm that built the prison. They said there were also problems with the plumbing system that were exploited. They even suggested that one of the guards simply fell asleep or was working with the prisoners. I mean, we've heard a whole host of reasons from the Israelis. Do you think that perhaps they're just coming up with excuses to try and cover up their embarrassment?
Of course. Yeah, this is typical. They're always trying to diminish the achievements of Palestine and the Palestinian people. They're always trying to say, well, something went wrong, or one person is responsible, or whatever. But the issue is that there is this dedication, there is this total commitment to achieving their freedom, to seeing their families, to, as one person said, 5 days smelling the fresh air of Palestine, of looking at Palestine, of eating some of the fruits and so on, is equal to a lifetime in prison. This is the kind of spirit, undefeated spirit of the Palestinian people. And this is something that is not consistent with the Israeli narrative and with the Israeli misrepresentation of the Palestinians. As you know, historically, Israel always labeled all Palestinians as terrorists, and so it goes on and on and on. They never say Palestinian unless they add the term terrorist to it. So the denial of the humanity, the denial of the spirit, the denial of the dedication, of the real human nature of the Palestinian people and narrative, this now is not so credible, given the fact that reality is coming out, that people have a chance to look at what's happening, to address the Palestinians directly, to utilize social media and other means in order to debunk the myths and expose the lies of Israel.
Hamas announced that there will be no prisoner exchanges in the future with the Israelis unless they include the 6 men from Gilboa, essentially that they will be free in any case. What do you make of that? Yeah, that really encouraged Palestinian people, because these 6 deserve to be free. And we believe all Palestinians deserve to be free, that all Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli prisons are being held unlawfully and unjustly. But in any prisoner exchange, certainly,
they, as well as others like Marwan Barouti and Hamad Saadat and others, have to be released. So the fact is they paid the price of their captivity, so to speak, and they showed the world how they can break the walls of their prison, how they can defy the conditions of their injustice. So certainly, yes, they should be at the top of the list.
Doctor, I wanted to ask you, the Lebanese newspaper Alaqbar reported from an unnamed source that the Palestinian Authority had agreed to help the Israelis catch the men in exchange for easing of prison conditions. Do you think this report is credible, and what are your thoughts on it?
No, I would like to check the source, frankly speaking. I don't know who told this to Alaqbar. It has to be credible, because I don't believe that there's any Palestinian who will betray these people, whether the leadership or among the people. And everybody, including the government and the presidency, everybody expressed solidarity with the prisoners, with the liberated prisoners, with those still in prison, and maintained their commitment to them. So I don't think that anybody would betray them in any way. No.
Right. I also wasn't sure if it's an attempt to sow discord, as they were also putting other stories out and so on.
Of course, they attempted to say that they were handed over or betrayed by other Palestinians in villages and so on. So, as usual, the source of information should never be Israel.
Why is it important for people to understand, to acknowledge that the men the self-liberated men, they're freedom fighters, they're resistance fighters, not just morally, ethically, but indeed legally under international law?
It is important because, as I said, Israel has been trying to distort and malign the Palestinian struggle as a whole, and the Palestinian people, including individuals and freedom fighters and so on. Look, Israel has arrested over 1 million people since 1967 only, Palestinians, and has killed over 75,000 Palestinians. Does that mean Israel has found a nation of terrorists? Does it mean that Israel has a system of justice for its people under its occupation and held in captivity? Does it mean that the Israeli military courts and the Israeli laws and occupiers' laws and so on hand out justice to the Palestinian people? These are occupiers who are using every possible means, including utter lawlessness and violence, against a captive population. And then they give themselves the right to arrest, to detain, to kill, extrajudicial killings, and so on, and to brand everybody who defies its oppression and occupation as a terrorist. So placing things in context, contextualizing the reality of these prisoners or self-liberating. Actually, people remain free inside, even though you are held in captivity. So to try to malign them and to try to justify why they're there and to try once again, I mean, the way they were treated when they were caught, it's just horrendous. The way they were beaten, the way they were insulted and abused and so on, it's horrific. But this is the nature of the Israeli occupation and a settler colonial regime that is based on pure, unadulterated racism. Racism, Islamophobia, denial of the humanity of the other, using any means of control in order to be able to maintain a stronghold and to steal the land and resources, as well as the narrative and reality and identity of the Palestinian people.
One of the prisoners, Zakaria Zubaydi, we heard that he's been treated so badly, beaten up so badly by the Israelis that he was sent to the intensive care unit. And there's a media blackout on his health condition. Do we have any news on that front about how he's doing, or is this blackout still in place?
I think his lawyer came out and talked about how he was beaten up and with broken bones and his face and his head was. So news is coming out, and it comes through Palestinian lawyers or people who are able to reach him, and they're not many. I think only one person was able to reach him. But when you look at the photos of his arrest and the ways in which they tried to cover him up so that he won't be seen. The army, the soldiers were surrounding him, but you could see his face, and they said his face, his head. And of course he had previous injuries, so they targeted these injuries in the legs and so on. And the whole history of Zakaria's baby, the way they killed his mother by an Israeli sniper, killed his father, arrested and killed many of his siblings and so on. It's just a history of tragedies, a history of willful, deliberate cruelty and murder, actually. And he hasn't been tried, by the way. He has been held for years. Because when you don't have evidence, this administrative detention is just horrific. They don't have evidence, they just want to punish somebody for no reason. It is part of the Israeli mindset and the occupation. And so the story of Zakaria must be told and must be understood in its context. And the film that was made, Arna's Children, talks about a bit of his history. But at the same time, his family and his extended family and community and Jenin and the refugee camp in Jenin, as well as all of Palestine, it encapsulates this story of Zakaria, encapsulates the most horrific injustices imposed on the Palestinian people, and must be seen, must be heard, must be read in order to understand the true nature of this settler colonial regime and this apartheid system in Palestine.
And it's a very heartbreaking story. And just as a last question, Doctor, what would you like to see from the movement in general? You mentioned unity among Palestinians everywhere, and that's a beautiful thing. What would you like to see going forward from the resistance movement towards the liberation of Palestine?
Yeah, well, liberation is a right, I always say. We all have the right to live in freedom and dignity on our own land. We have the right to exercise the fullness of our humanity. In terms of our own struggle, I mean, the struggle continues, as you know, in different shapes and forms. Nonviolent resistance, whether it is the will to stay on the land, to me, is the most important thing. Being able to remain, to defy, not to succumb, not to be defeated in your spirit, not to abandon your rights, and not to relinquish your urge, your drive to be free, singularly and collectively. This is very important. And of course, the most important thing is to be able to withstand all these injustices and pressures, to stay on the land and to maintain your spirit and your commitment.
This escape was the largest and most successful of the last 20 years in Palestine, and therefore the Israelis want to make an example out of the 6 men. But the simple fact of the matter is that these men are not criminals. Remember, one of them has not even been charged with a crime, let alone convicted. And he spent 2 years in jail. But in the mainstream media, they always insist on using terms like militant or terrorist or whatever else the Israeli government wants to call Palestinians. But what is their crime? Resisting a foreign military occupation which has killed their families and taken their land? And then when they escape from prison, which is a natural human instinct, they are beaten and tortured? These men are freedom fighters by definition. Everyone has the right under international law to resist a foreign military occupation, including Palestinians. This is spelled out very clearly under international law by the United Nations, the Geneva Convention. These men, like all Palestinians, have extraordinary resilience and courage not to give up after all that they've been through and to pull off such an escape. They not only freed themselves, but raised the morale of all and gave hope to millions of Palestinians also living under occupation. Whether the Israelis capture one or capture all 6, at the end of the day, what these men did at Gilboa was a victory for the resistance front, which cannot be taken away. Regardless of the outcome, the simple fact is that these men liberated themselves from the cruel imprisonment of the occupier, and that is a victory in and of itself. The fact that they did this with a rusty spoon makes it all the more incredible. As a matter of fact, people started throwing spoons at the Israeli embassy in Washington in a show of solidarity with them. And in another show of support, Hamas recently announced that there will be no more prisoner exchanges with Israel without the 6 men from Gilboa. So in essence, whether the Israelis like it or not, those 6 men will be free, one way or another. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is the Communiqué.